On a quiet, frigid night, daily life in the small town unfolded as it typically would. People rushed home, huddled against the biting wind, oblivious to the tragedy that was playing out just a few blocks away. There, in the middle of the street, was a stray dog. Her thin body shook, her eyes barely open, and her distended belly told a story of starvation. She was not only fighting for her life, she was fighting for the tiny lives blossoming inside her. Story comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. She had been ignored for hours. Cars passed by. Pedestrians peeked, but nobody intervened. No one cared. She was another stray, another lost soul in a city that couldn't afford to care. But then David arrived. A guy who had no idea that his destiny was about to bring him into something remarkable. He had just been driving home from work, his thoughts fixed on little more than dinner and a warm blanket. But rounding the corner, something unusual caught his eye. At first, it appeared to be just a ragged ball of old clothes rolled on the pavement. But his gut told him to back off. His heart leapt. He saw a slight movement. He parked and stepped outside into the cold. "Please, don't let it be too late," he whispered, the air around him freezing with his breath. It broke his heart to kneel beside her. There was no flesh on her bones, her body battered by life on the streets, and she was pregnant, very pregnant. David's pulse quickened. He realized she wouldn't make it without immediate assistance. Without missing a beat, he reached and picked her up, her body drooping under the weight of life. She didn't resist. It seemed as if she had already accepted defeat and was just waiting for whatever else was to come. But David wasn't ready to lose her. Not yet. He ran back to his car, laid her delicately on the passenger seat and covered her with his jacket. His hands shook as he turned over the engine. The closest animal clinic was 15 minutes away, but it felt like an eternity. "Stay with me," he murmured, looking at her every few seconds. "Just hang in there a little longer." Her breath was shallow, her chest heaving with effort. David's thoughts raced. How had she ended up here? How long had she suffered alone? At last, the clinic was in sight, its neon sign shining in the distance like a guiding star. David parked haphazardly and charged through the doors, the dog cradled in his arms. "I need help. She's dying," he said, raising his voice. The vet on call quickly jumped into action, examining the dog's condition with well-practiced hands. His face grew serious. "She's very critical," the vet said solemnly. "We have to move quickly if we hope to save her. And her puppies." David's heart sank. He knew the odds weren't on their side. But he refused to give up. "Whatever it takes," he said decisively. "She deserves a chance." David could only stand by and watch as the vet and his team moved frantically, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done all he could. Now, what happened next was up to fate and the prowess of the veterinarians. He didn't realize at the time the journey had only just begun, one that would lead to a life-changing tale for both the stray dog and himself. In that cold, tentative clinic room, time stood still. Tensions ran high, the seconds dragging as time lost its meaning. David walked back and forth, his eyes fixed on the door that led to the treatment area. What ifs flooded his mind. What if she didn't make it? What if it were already too late? On the other side of the door, the vet and his staff were in full emergency mode. The stray dog was hanging on by a thread. Her breathing was labored, her heart rate alarmingly low. Far more dire than what they had initially believed. Not just the mother, but her unborn puppies were struggling for their lives. The vet glanced at his assistant and shook his head slightly. "We've got to stabilize her first," he said urgently. "If we don't, she's not going to be able to have her puppies." They gave her oxygen, started IV fluids, and worked feverishly to bring her back from the edge. Every second that ticked by was a minor victory, or a crushing defeat. And David stood frozen, staring at the clock on the wall. Never in his life had he felt so helpless. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the door opened, and the vet stepped out, his face a blend of hope and concern. "She's stable, for now," the vet said, his voice steady and grave, "but it's not over yet. We will keep a close eye on her throughout the night. Then, if her condition stays stable, there's a chance of saving the puppies too." David felt waves of relief, but they didn't last. He knew the fight was only beginning. Nevertheless, there was a new glimmer of hope, one he hadn't felt since the moment he had found her lying on the street. He nodded, his voice steady. "Thank you. Please just do everything you are able to do." He pats me on the shoulder, the vet. "We will. She's a fighter. Don't lose hope." "I'm not going anywhere," David said, and sat in the waiting room. He didn't want her sitting by herself, not after everything she had been through. Hours passed, the machines of the clinic humming softly, the only sound in the quiet night. The vet came back around midnight. This time he had a little smile on his face. "She is responding well," said the vet. "It's incredible. Most dogs in her condition wouldn't have survived this long, but there's something about her. She's not going down without a fight. And I think she might actually do it." David felt inside his heart a mixture of gratitude and awe. This tiny, sick little stray, who had been so close to death, was hanging on with everything she had, not only for herself, but for the unborn puppies she carried inside. For the first time that evening, David let himself breathe a bit easier. He didn't know what would come the next day, but one thing was sure. This dog wasn't going to quit, and neither was he. Unbeknownst to him, the true miracle was merely a few steps away. The sun rose quietly over the city, casting a soft glow through the clinic's windows. David sat in the corner of the waiting room, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but unwilling to close. The dog had survived the night, a small miracle in itself, but the battle was far from over. Just as he was about to take a sip of his now cold coffee, the clinic door swung open. The vet walked in, his expression unreadable. David stood up immediately, his heart racing once again. "She made it through the night," the vet began, pausing for a brief moment. "But there's something unusual." David's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? Is something wrong?" The vet nodded, motioning for David to follow him. "It's better if I show you." They entered the treatment room, where the stray dog lay resting on a soft blanket. Her breathing was still labored, but her eyes were open now, a faint spark of life returning. David knelt beside her, gently stroking her head. "Hey, girl, you're doing great," he whispered. The vet crouched down next to him. "We ran some tests," he said. "It's not just that she's severely malnourished. There's something else. She's been through more than we realized." He pointed to several scars across her body, old wounds that had long since healed but told a harrowing story. These scars, they suggest she's been abused for a long time. This wasn't just a stray trying to survive on the streets. She was abandoned after suffering unimaginable cruelty. David's heart sank. He couldn't believe it. How could anyone be so heartless? This dog had endured so much, yet she was still fighting to stay alive, for her and her unborn puppies. But the vet wasn't finished. "There's more," he continued. "Her puppies. We initially thought there were 2 or 3, but the ultrasound shows she's carrying 5, and one of them is in distress." David felt a lump form in his throat. "Is there anything you can do?" "We'll try," the vet assured him. "But it's going to be a delicate process. If her condition worsens, we may have to perform an emergency C-section. It's risky, but it might be her only chance." David nodded, determination burning in his eyes. "Do it. Whatever it takes. Just save her and the puppies." The next few hours were a blur of activity. The vet and his team worked tirelessly, monitoring the dog's condition and preparing for the possibility of surgery. David stayed by her side, whispering words of encouragement and hope. "You're stronger than you know," he told her. "We're not giving up on you. Not now, not ever." Suddenly, a soft whimper escaped from the dog's throat. Her eyes locked onto David's, filled with both pain and trust. It was as if she understood everything he was saying, as if she knew she wasn't alone anymore. And then, something incredible happened. Her breathing steadied, her body relaxed, and for the first time since David had found her, she seemed at peace. "She's fighting back," the vet said, a hint of surprise in his voice. "It's almost like she knows we're trying to help her." David smiled, tears welling up in his eyes. "She's a warrior," he said softly. "She's been fighting her whole life. She's not about to stop now." But just as hope began to rise, the heart monitor beeped erratically. The vet's expression shifted instantly, her heart rates spiking. "We need to move fast." The calm shattered into chaos as the team rushed into action, preparing for the emergency procedure. David stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. The stakes had just been raised. Would she survive the operation? Would her puppies make it? David could only watch and pray as the miracle he had been hoping for hung in the balance. The vet's team worked in sync, each second precious. The air around was a flurry of urgency, machines beeping, sterile implements clinking. The stray dog lay on the operating table, her life and the lives of her unborn puppies at stake. David froze just outside the door, peeking through the small window. His hands had balled into helpless sides of fists, wishing he could do anything. His pulse quickened, matching the erratic ticking of the heart monitor within. "She's strong," he murmured, barely audible. "She's gotten this far. She's not going to quit now." Inside the operating room, the vet's voice was steady, authoritative. "Her heart rate is dropping again. We have to get these puppies out," she said. The team devoted themselves, their minds absorbing their work. The first puppy emerged, a tiny, fragile thing, hardly moving. For a second, the room went quiet. "Is it breathing?" "Are you kidding?" one of the assistants said, panic in her voice. The vet placed her hand on the puppy's chest and stroked it gently, murmuring softly. And then, a miracle. An involuntary gasp, then a feeble but fierce shout. A collective sigh of relief swept the room. "And that's one," said the vet, glancing at the others. "Let's keep going." The puppies were delivered one by one. Others were more potent, small wails that filled the air with hope. But it wasn't over yet. The last puppy, and the one they had worried was suffering, was still inside, and time was of the essence. David could sense urgency in the vet's movement. His heart was in his throat. "Come on," he whispered. "You can do this." The vet gently reached for the last puppy, his hands both sure and quick. For a terrifying instant, the puppy didn't react. Except for the beeping of the heart monitor, the room was all too quiet. And then, a tiny, barely detectable twitch, The vet's assistant jumped into action, clearing the puppy's airway and stimulating its tiny body. Another gasp, another cry. David's knees nearly collapsed with relief. Tears sprang into his eyes as he watched the last little puppy tumbling in to join the others, each one alive, each one a miracle. The vet stood back, his face weary but pleased. He looked over at David and smiled tiredly at him. "They all made it," he said. "Every single one." David experienced an overwhelming flood of emotions: relief, gratitude, joy. He forced himself through the door and knelt beside the mother dog, who was still trembling but breathing steady. "You did it," he said, his voice breaking. "You saved them. You're a hero." The dog's eyes fluttered open, her gaze fixing on David's. In that moment, there was something nearly magical, some shared connection, a bond formed through shared struggle and survival. The puppies snuggled against their mother, warm and safe between her legs for the first time in their lives. It was a moment of stark, unvarnished hope, that even at the blackest times, life persists. "Thank you," David said, looking up at the vet, his gratitude evident. "I can't thank you enough. You saved her. You saved all of them." The vet, drying his hands on a towel, smiled. "It wasn't just us. She fought just as hard. She wanted to live for them." David nodded, wiping a tear from his face. He knew this was true. This dog wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior, a beacon of resilience and strength. But as he peered down at the fragile family before him, one thought echoed in his mind. This was only the beginning. After a long and grueling night, dawn broke over the city. Inside the clinic, relief and cautious optimism hung in the air. The mother dog lay curled up on the ground, tired but alive, with her newborn puppies snuggled up alongside her. Their little bodies lifted and fell with each breath, small but mighty signs of life. At this, David stood on the doorframe and added to the peace before him. It was a bit surreal, as if he was in a dream. The chaotic moments he experienced during the emergency surgery still remained imprinted in his head, but right now he had one thought. They had made it. Somehow they made it. The vet came in, carrying a clipboard. His eyes were tired but kind. "She's stable, and the puppies look healthy," he added, smiling. "They're not out of the woods yet, but we're cautiously hopeful." David let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Thank you," he said, trying to swallow the emotion in his voice. "I don't know what I would have done if—" He paused, unable to complete the thought. The vet patted him reassuringly on the shoulder. "She's a fighter," he said. "But now, she's going to need lots of rest, ample nutrition, and, perhaps most importantly, someone to be around the clock with both her and the puppies." David nodded, keeping his eyes on the mother dog. The question didn't cross his mind. He was part of her journey since he spotted her on the cold street. To walk away now simply wasn't an option. "I will take care of her," he said. "I'm going to ensure she and her puppies have what they need." The vet's smile widened. "I suspected you would say that." For the next few hours, David took a crash course on how to care for a nursing dog and her newborns. He diligently wrote down the feeding schedule, the signs to watch out for, how to make a safe, comfortable space for the tiny family at home. By the time he was prepared to leave, clinic staff had already packed a box of supplies: blankets, bottles, and special food for Mom. David balanced a box in one arm, holding the mother dog in the other, her puppies nestled against her. Outside, fresh morning air reinvigorated him. He looked down at the dog, sleeping serenely in his arms. "You are going to be okay," he whispered. "I promise. your family now. It was a quiet, calming drive home, very different than the chaos-filled night that had united them. David finally arrived, and with great care brought the dog and her puppies into the house, placing her in a corner of the living room in a soft nest. The mother dog curled in on herself, and her puppies pressed against her warmth. For the first time in what could not have felt like anything other than forever, she was safe, truly safe. David sat next to her, his heart running over with feelings he found hard to describe. There was something so deeply humbling about watching new life up close and being trusted with the lives of these fragile beings. But as he watched the puppies squirming and nuzzling their mother, he couldn't shake the sense that something was amiss. It wasn't fear or anxiety. It was something else. It was the sense that there was more to this story yet to come, because life has a hilarious knack for flipping us just when we think we've run out. For the first few days, everything seemed almost too good to be true. The mother dog, whom David had started calling Luna, grew stronger with each passing hour. Her puppies, small and delicate, nursed eagerly, filling the house with soft whimpers and tiny, playful movements. David had transformed his living room into a sanctuary, a cozy corner lined with blankets, soft pillows, and enough space for Luna to stretch out with her pups. He stayed by her side as much as possible, watching her with a mix of awe and admiration. "She's a natural," the vet had told him during a follow-up visit. "It's amazing how well she's adjusting after everything she's been through." But David knew better than to get too comfortable. Luna was a survivor, yes, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Puppies this young were incredibly vulnerable, and their health could change in an instant. On the fourth night, just as David was preparing for bed, something unexpected happened. He heard a faint whimper from the corner of the room, so soft it almost didn't register. At first, he thought it was just one of the puppies stirring in its sleep. But then it happened again, louder this time. David rushed over, his heart racing. One of the smaller puppies, a little brown one with white paws, was lying on its side, its breathing shallow and labored. "Come on, little one," David whispered, gently picking up the puppy and cradling it in his hands. The tiny body felt almost weightless. "Stay with me." He grabbed the phone and called the emergency vet clinic, his voice trembling as he explained the situation. "He's barely breathing. What do I do?" The vet on the other end of the line remained calm, guiding David through the steps to stabilize the puppy. He followed every instruction, his hands steady, but his heart pounding. After what felt like an eternity, the puppy let out a weak but steady breath. Its tiny eyes blinked open, and David felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Good job, little fighter," he whispered, carefully placing the puppy back with its siblings. But that moment of relief quickly turned into a sobering realization. This was only the beginning. Taking care of a newborn litter wasn't just about providing food and warmth. It was about being ready for anything, at any time. The next few days were a blur of late-night bottle feedings, constant temperature checks, and moments of pure joy mixed with overwhelming exhaustion. David found himself marveling at how much love could grow in such a short time. Luna, for her part, seemed to understand exactly what was happening. Whenever one of her puppies stirred or whimpered, she was there, licking them gently, nuzzling them close. But then, just when David started to believe they had turned a corner, something happened that shook him to his core. It was late in the evening when he noticed Luna acting strangely. She was pacing around the room, her eyes darting toward the front door. Her ears were pinned back, her body tense. "What is it, girl?" David asked, kneeling beside her. Luna let out a low, almost guttural growl, something David had never heard from her before. She wasn't just anxious, she was scared. David's heart skipped a beat. He walked to the window and peered outside, his breath fogging the glass. The street was empty, but something didn't feel right. Luna stayed close to the puppies, her eyes never leaving the door. It was as if she knew something David didn't, as if the past she had tried so hard to escape was finally catching up to her. And in that moment, David realized this story was far from over. The real challenge hadn't even begun yet. For the first time since David had brought Luna and her puppies home, he felt uneasy. Luna's odd behavior earlier that evening had given him an uneasy feeling. She was usually calm and affectionate, but tonight she was something other, guarded and tense, on high alert. Luna hovered over her puppies in a tight ball. Her ears perked up at every noise. Her eyes flew to the front door every few seconds. Nearby, David sat watching her. "It's all right, girl," he said, attempting to comfort her. But on some level, he didn't believe it. The wind whipped outside, shaking the windows. The house responded with a quiet creak. David attempted to shake off the sense that something, or someone, was watching them. He locked the doors and windows behind them, double-checking the locks before heading back over to Luna. Just as he sat down, Luna suddenly got up, ears pricked and eyes focused on the front door. A deep, rumbling growl issued from her throat. David's pulse quickened. His eyes darted to the door, but all he saw outside the window was blackness. Yet the tension in the room was almost palpable. There was a pause before they replied. Then, just as David started to settle in, there was a sound, a gentle but clear scratching at the front door. His throat constricted around his breath. He wasn't expecting anyone. It was nearly midnight. Who could it be? Luna's growl grew low, her body tightening as she stood in front of the door and her puppies. David rose slowly, heart racing in his chest. "Stay here," he said gently to Luna, though he didn't know whether he was trying to comfort her or himself. The day after the spill, in a warehouse on the outskirts of town, he approached the door cautiously, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He took a deep breath and unlocked the door, opening it just a smidgen. In the beginning, there was only raw darkness. The street was deserted, the wind whistling through the trees. Then, the movement caught his eyes. A shadow, someone who slipped into the dark. David's heart raced. "Hey!" he shouted, walking out onto the porch. But the figure had already disappeared into the darkness. His breath hung in the cold air as he stood for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Was it a stranger passing by? Or something more sinister? The door was shut and was tightly locked as he was shaken by the ambivalence. When he looked back to Luna, she was still standing at attention, and her eyes were full of a quiet intensity. David kneeled beside her, spreading a hand gently over her back. "It's okay," he said softly. "No one hurts you or your babies. I won't let them." Luna gradually eased and leaned into David's hand. But as she lay down with her puppies again, David couldn't help but feel that this was no coincidence. He gazed at Luna, his thoughts in a whirl. Whoever had put her there, whoever had hurt her, might not be through with her yet. David did know one thing. He needed to protect her, no matter what. David hardly slept that night. Every sound, every creak of the house sent his heart racing. Luna had eventually calmed and gone to sleep with her puppies, but David could not get the image of the shadowy figure fading into the darkness out of his mind. The morning was a strange blend of relief and the unknown. The light pouring in through the windows seemed to wash away the fear of the night. But somewhere deep inside, David sensed something was off. Luna moved in her bed, raised her head and blinked at the soft light. She appeared calmer, but there was a wary glance in her eyes. David knelt next to her and patted her reassuringly. "Hey, girl, you did so good last night," he said gently. "You protected them. You're a good mom." The puppies snuggled against her, their little bodies warm and safe. And for a brief moment, everything seemed right again. Then David's phone buzzed, shattering the peace. It was the veterinarian. "David, I've been thinking about Luna," the vet said, sounding serious. "Her scars, her reaction last night. I believe there's more to her story than we initially thought. I did a little digging, and you're not going to believe what I found." David's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "There's been an increase in the number of abandoned dogs that match Luna's description in your area," the vet said. "Some were rescued from a nearby property known for less than humane practices." He paused. "It's conceivable that Luna escaped from a scenario much more dire than we thought was the case." David tightened his grip on the phone. "You mean she was abused?" "It's highly likely," the vet said. "And if someone went to all that trouble to keep her locked away, then they might come looking for her." David shivered at the thought. All at once, that menacing shape from the previous night really came into focus. What if they weren't only passing through? What if they were searching for Luna? He looked over at Luna, who was now looking at him with those deep, soulful eyes. She'd been through so much, more than anyone should ever have to. And now, even after they've gotten away, the threat may lie in wait beyond their escape. David inhaled deeply, attempting to calm down. "If they think they're getting her back, they have another thing coming," he muttered. He disconnected and returned his focus to Luna. "We're not going anywhere, and we're not backing down," he said defiantly. "I don't know who did this to you, but they're not going to touch you or these puppies ever again. I promise." Luna seemed to understand. She leaned into him, her body softening just a touch more. But promises weren't going to be enough for David. He needed a plan. He fortified every door and window in the house so that nothing and no one could enter without his knowledge. He even set up a security camera at the front door, steadfast in monitoring suspicious activity. Then he rang a couple of close friends for advice, describing the situation without sharing too much detail. "If something happens," he said, "I need someone to know the full story." Despite having passed the day quietly, the tension never fully left the air. Any car that passed, any noise from outside sent David's pulse racing. But even though the fear had remained within him, so too had something else, something stronger, that pressed up against his chest and forced him to take another look. Something similar to hatred, something like outrage, a determination to protect this family at all costs. That night, David sat with Luna and her puppies as the sun set on the horizon. His heart swelled, bittersweet and determined. He had caught Luna at her most vulnerable. She had struggled to live, to produce her puppies. Now it was his turn to battle for her. And whoever was out here, whoever thought they could take her back, was about to realize they were up against something a lot more powerful than they had reckoned. Because David was no longer defending a dog. He was protecting family. Darkness had descended and cloaked the neighborhood in stillness. The silence was interrupted only by the hum of distant motor vehicles. David was sitting on the couch, his eyes darting between Luna and the live feed from the newly installed security camera on his phone. Hours went by without incident, but David could not shake the sense that something, or someone, was watching. Each creak of the house sent chills down his spine. He found himself looking at the front door more than he normally would, waiting for something he couldn't quite identify. Then it happened, and then something moved outside, a blur darting across the front yard, too quick to be a trick of the light. David bolted up, his heart pounding. He scrolled back, his fingers shaking as he tapped the screen. And there it was, again, a fleeting figure, fading back into darkness. Not again, he said to himself. Luna could feel his tension, her eyes fixated on him. She was standing, body rigid, ears forward, towards the door. The same low growl from the previous night rumbled in her throat. Fear and fury flooded David as he clenched his jaw. Whoever this was, they were ballsy enough to return twice. But why? He picked up his phone and called the vet again. The line rang twice until the vet answered. "David? Is everything okay?" "No," David said, his voice still low but steady. "Someone's been outside my house, twice now. I caught them on camera. I don't know who it is, but it sounds like they're here for Luna." The vet hesitated before answering. "David, listen to me. They won't stop until they do, if they want her back bad enough. The first thing that you have to do is to be ready for anything. I can get in touch with some contacts, people who work in animal welfare investigations. They might be able to help." David nodded, feeling more steadfast already. "Yes, do that. Whatever it takes." He finished with the call and sat back with a deep breath to calm his nervousness. He realized that he didn't have financial room to panic. Luna was in need of him more than ever now. Resolute, he spent the next 60 minutes scrubbing through security footage, frame by frame to catch a better look at the figure. But every frame showed only that same blurry shadow, enough to prove someone was present, but not enough to identify who. David was frustrated. He leaned back in his chair and ran a hand through his hair. He felt like he was playing a game for which he didn't know the rules, a game with dangerously high stakes. All at once, a sound escaped Luna's throat, breaking David out of his trance. She approached him with a calm intensity in her eyes. It felt like she was trying to say something to him. David got down on one knee and looked in her eyes. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said softly. "I will not allow anyone to harm you ever again." But as he spoke, a counterthought crept in, one he couldn't shake. What if Luna's past was complicated in ways he'd only begun to understand? What if there were more than one thing they wanted that had to be gotten back? And that wasn't just her, but the puppies as well? The thought made David's stomach drop. He had vowed that he would defend them at all costs, and that was precisely what he was about to do. From then on, he spent the rest of the night practicing. He reached out to his closest friends, asking them to remain on high alert. He kept his phone fully charged and the security app open at all times. Yet as much as he had prepared, something huge was gnawing at his insides, something that told him the worst was yet to come. And sitting in the darkened living room as Luna nursed her tiny family, he couldn't help but wonder, what had Luna escaped from? The answer was out there somewhere, waiting for him in the shadows. The only question was when it would catch up with them. The stress in the house was unbearable. Any sound from outside sent David's heart pounding. The shadowy figure that kept showing up. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. It was a threat increasing in boldness with every night. David had not shared with anyone outside his inner circle what was going on. He didn't want to scare his neighbors or attract unnecessary attention. but in his heart of hearts, he understood that things were spiraling. And fast. He barely left Luna's side that night. She lay curled up with her puppies, her eyes half closed, but still watchful, her body taut as if she were anticipating something. David patted her head softly. "It's okay, girl. I am here," he whispered. The words had barely left his lips when the security camera app on his phone lit up with a notification. Motion detected. Front yard. David's blood ran cold. He clicked on it, and there appeared a figure, lurking, half obscured by the shadows at the edge of his property. This time, they were not running. They were just sitting there, watching. His heart raced within his chest. "Who are you?" he grumbled as he clenched the phone tighter in his hand. The figure didn't move for a few agonizing moments, face hidden by the dark. Then without a word, they took a half step closer, just a half step, but one that sent a jolt of adrenaline through David's body. David jumped up, heart pounding. He wasn't going to be passive as bad things happened. Not this time. He took a flashlight, walked through the front door, and his mind was focused and clear. He knew that might not have been the smartest move, but he couldn't live in fear forever. "Stay here, Luna," he said rigidly, looking back at her. She made a soft whine, clearly not happy about him leaving, but David nodded reassuringly. "I'll be right back." He swung open the door and was greeted by a wall of cold night air. His breath showed in the dim light, and he swept the flashlight across the yard. The yard was bathed in the beam of light. It lit up every inch, but the figure was gone. David's eyes glanced back and forth, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. But the moment he turned to head back into the house, something on the ground grabbed his attention. A small folded piece of paper lay next to the front steps. His chest tightened and he bent over, fingers quivering slightly as he picked it up. The paper was old and crumpled, but the message scrawled across it with shaky handwriting was clear. "You can't hide her forever." David's blood turned to ice. He froze for a moment, looking at the note, trying to process it. But its meaning was impossible to misinterpret. Whoever had left it was not merely watching. They were sending a message. He dashed back into the house, locking the door behind him. Luna glanced up at him, sensing he was upset. David knelt next to her, clutching the note tightly in his hand. "We are not running," he said quietly but emphatically. "We are way too far gone for that." He took a breath deep enough for his mind to race. This was no longer about survival. It was war. And for anyone who thought these people could intimidate him into returning Luna, let there be no doubt. They surrounded the wrong man. It was time for David to take action. The waiting and watching were behind them. He dialed the vet again on his cell phone. "I need those contacts you talked about," he said, his voice steady. "It's worse than we thought." The vet didn't hesitate. "I'll make some calls. We're going to get this sorted out." David ended the call and leaned against the wall, with the note still in his hand. He had no idea what the coming days would hold, but one thing was clear. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. David was standing in his kitchen holding the crumpled note. His thoughts raced. Whoever had been hanging around outside his house was not some random stranger. They were watching, lurking, and sending a message. They wanted Luna back. Not that David was going to let that happen. Not now, not ever. He looked toward Luna, who lay silently with her puppies, her eyes tracking his every move. You could feel her trust in him. It encouraged him to override the fear that wanted to creep into his mind. David picked up the phone and called the vet again. This time, there was no pause. "We must act quickly," he added. "I'm hoping they make their next move. I want to know those people, and how do we stop them?" The vet's tone was level but grave. "I already contacted a friend who does animal protection cases. She has dealt with them in the past. I think she can help you. Can you meet her tomorrow?" David nodded, resolution in his eyes. "Absolutely." His first stop the next day, David drove out to a small coffee shop on the edge of town. He parked the car, glanced at the place, and felt the jitters. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half hoping to see the shadowy figure from the previous night lurking behind him. The vet's contact, a woman named Claire, was already inside waiting. She appeared calm and confident, the sort of person who had been through it all and wasn't easily shaken. "I'm David," he said, offering a hand. "I've heard about your situation. Let's sit down and talk." For the next hour, David told her everything. The night he rescued Luna, the scars on her body, the strange figure outside his home, and the note the night they had come. Claire kept listening, her face growing more serious with each detail. It was clear Luna had escaped something terrible, she finally said. "Seeing the condition she was in when you found her, and the fact that someone is looking for her, that means she probably came from an illegal breeding operation or worse." David's stomach turned. "What do we do?" Claire stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "Step 1. We need to make sure you and Luna are safe. I'll notify the local authorities and open an inquiry. But until then, you have to keep your guard up. Never turn off the security cameras. Don't go anywhere alone. And if anything feels off, you call me at once." David nodded. "What about those who are searching for her? What if they come back?" "They most likely will," Claire said. "But this time, we're going to be ready for them." David got up from his seat and walked out of the coffee shop, feeling fulfilled. He was no longer alone in this fight. He had support, a plan, and above all, a why. A few months after he came home, the house felt changed. Fear that had gripped him the night before was replaced by resolve. He spent the rest of the day weaving extra measures into the house's security, making sure the locks were secure, and reviewing security footage from the past several nights. Luna seemed to detect this change in him. She remained nearby, her eyes glistening with quiet strength. "You're safe," David told her that night. "No one's ever going to harm you again." But in his heart, he knew his battle wasn't done. It was just beginning. And when those people encountered them next, they wouldn't be confronted with fear. They'd be met with a fight. David stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee, watching the security feed on his phone. All of him was on alert. He was still haunted by the note the letter left on his doorstep, a chilling reminder that someone was watching, using the Time government paycheck sheets in the worst possible way. He had done everything he could: fortified locks, enhanced security camera, motion detectors around the property. But a nagging sense of anxiety remained. Luna appeared calmer that morning, her primal instincts taking over as she gently nudged her puppies. She'd come a long way from the thin, terrified dog that David had rescued from off the street. He was awed by her strength and resilience. "You're amazing, you know that," David said softly, crouching next to her. Luna raised her head and licked his hand, eyes shining with trust. But for all the serenity of the moment, David could not lower his defenses. Those who had injured Luna once would have no reason not to do so again. His phone buzzed, jolting him out of his musings. It was Claire, the animal protection person who had met with him. "David, I have some news," she said, her voice calm but grave. "We've got some intel on the group that might be pursuing Luna. It's worse than we thought." David squeezed the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "This is not an isolated case. They're part of a broader scheme, illegal breeding and dog fighting. Luna most likely escaped from one of their outposts. That not only makes her a target, but a valuable one. They will go to any lengths to get her back." David felt his stomach drop. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place, and the picture they painted was much worse than the one he had imagined. "What do we do now?" he asked. Claire didn't hesitate. "I've reached out to local authorities, and they're gearing up to storm one of their recognized sites. But in the meantime, you should prepare for anything. Luna and the puppies need constant supervision. If you see anyone suspicious, call me right away." The man nodded, and David felt a hardening of determination in his chest. "Thank you, Claire. We'll be ready." After he hung up, he took a deep breath. It was starting to sink in. He looked at Luna, who was now staring at him through narrowed eyes, sensing his discomfort. "It's okay, girl," he whispered. "They are not going to win, and we're not going to win. Not this time." That evening, David trawled through security for the last few days, staying up late. He had a hunch that something big was about to happen. He'd learned to believe in his instincts. They had saved him and Luna so far. When the clock struck past midnight, he heard a soft noise come from outside. His heart jumped into his throat. He took out his cell phone and accessed the live security footage. A figure lurked in the shadows, toward the edge of the yard. David's pulse quickened. This time they weren't fleeing. They were waiting, watching. He tensed his jaw, his fingers tightening on the phone. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He wasn't going to stand by and let them take away what meant the most to him. If they were looking for a fight, they had found one. David's pulse quickened as he looked at the screen. This was it. He didn't hesitate. He snatched up his phone and called Claire, keeping one eye on the camera feed. "They're here," he said, his voice firm but charged. "I'm on my way," Claire texted back. "Stay inside. Make sure Luna and the puppies are safe. Help is coming." David hung up, locking each door and window in the house. Luna was next to him, her body taut, eyes on the front door. There was no fear in her eyes, only strength. "You've got this, girl," David said quietly, patting her in encouragement. "We are much too far to turn back now." The figure outside continued to approach and stopped right outside the front gate. For a few seconds, all went quiet, too quiet. And then there came footsteps on the gravel. David clutched his phone in his hand and only looked back to the door. All of his muscles were tense, prepared for whatever happened next. But moments later, blue and red lights swarmed the street. The cavalry had arrived. Claire and a team of officers sprang into action surrounding the property. The figure froze, knowing too late that the game was up. The threat was neutralized within minutes. Claire entered, looking around, hiding her gaze toward David. "It's done," she said, a small but relieved smile cracking on her face. "They won't be coming back." David breathed out, the tension finally leaving his body. He looked down at Luna, who remained protectively positioned over her puppies. He knelt down next to her, speaking gently. "We did it. You're safe now, all of you." Luna licked his hand, looking at him with love and trust. It was a still spot, a moment of triumph earned by blood and sweat and tears. Claire strolled up and folded her arms. "Luna's story was not just a story about survival," she said. "It's a story of resilience, of the power of kindness, and how a little bit of love can change everything. David smiled, his heart full. She changed my life too, more than she'll ever know. David smiled peacefully at them, understanding that this was more than just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a new life, a fresh beginning, a real home. Sometimes life places in our path those who need us most. And sometimes, if we're lucky, they save us just as much as we save them. Luna and her puppies are not just survivors, they are warriors. And their story, it's evidence that however bleak the situation may seem, there is always a way forward. Even the smallest bit of hope, and someone willing to listen. But for now, thank you for watching this incredible journey. If you believe in second chances and love conquering all, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to hear more uplifting content like the story that I just read you.